Hello and welcome. Today we are going to discuss some elements of short story. Before we should start reading short stories and prose passages, we must understand the different elements that constitute short stories and other prose writings. Today we are going to discuss only short stories and its elements. So let's begin. It is important to define what short story is. The word story is randomly used by us at different places. Any narration or description of any event is also a story. But when it comes to literature and written stories, we must need to understand that it has some special references to a kind of special narratives. So let us understand what a short story is. A short story is a small piece of narrative describing a limited number of events and characters, focusing on a particular event that conveys a powerful message. The things to be remembered here is that a small piece of narrative is describing an event and a series of events maybe in which we have very limited number of events, not too many events, only two or three events, major events, and then we have also limited number of characters, persons who work in the story. Remember, the motive of the story is to carry some message to the audience. So, all characters and events are focusing towards that one message. So, this is what is a definition of a short story. Now, the first element of the short story we must understand is plot. Many a times, plot and story are used synonymously at many places, whereas we must differentiate as a student of literature that plot and story are not the same. Plot is not a story. Story is described as a series of events, whereas plot is a structure of action that unfold events one by one to achieve some emotional effect. Remember, story may have a particular aim or not, but when we talk about plot is also a kind of a series of events, but which is logically connected to each other. The purpose of this logical connection is to achieve some emotional effect. Now, it also enables us to go through the actions of the characters directed by the motives of the character. Remember, when the writer writes the story, narrates it to the audience, his purpose is to unfold in front of the audience the character of the persons who are involved in the story. So we may find that there are two, three different attitudes of the people who come together to form any action. So, when we talk about plot, we must consider the logic of behavior of a person and also the series in which the events are unfolded or narrated to us. And when we reach out at the end of the narration, we find some conclusion there. When we talk about plot, we must consider one of the very famous structure plot given by Freytag. So, if you watch any cinema, read any novel, or read any short story, you would find a kind of structure in that. Any story begins with exposition, that is, introduction. It introduces us to the characters, the situations, and the settings, the backgrounds of that action. So, in the beginning, we are introduced with the attitudes of the characters basically when we talk about the short stories. Then you have initial action. The initial action is all about the first confrontation of two opposite forces together. Remember, the two opposite forces are not hero and villain only. There are many stories in which you would find the opposite force is not a human being, but sometimes it is a nature, or sometimes it may be a social entity, or sometimes it is a social evil or the tradition that the character fights with. So For the first time, the character starts fighting. The central character starts fighting is known as initial action. Then we have this portion in which we often find that the two opposite forces often meet each other, try to confront each other, and try to win the situations. This goes on until the last scene in which this conflict is solved, and one of these forces win. So this part of the story where the two forces come together, fight to each other, and try to claim its own victory is known as climax. It is also the highest peak of interest in our mind as audience to know who would be the winner of this conflict. And very often, as we know, that poetic justice, the one who stands for good, one who claims the good things, also wins. So this is what the climax is. And the final stage of any plot or story is conclusion. That is the delivery of the message that writer wants to give to the audience or the readers. So this is what a structure of a plot likes. Now the next element of the story is character. Now how would be the character defined in a literary way is it is a personality that is expressed through the speech and the action of the person in the story. Remember, these are the three important areas. It is the personality, outer and inner both, expressed through the speech and the action. Speech is something that is known as dialogues in our day-to-day life, and action, the things, all the things that the person does in that story. So by his actions and by whatever he speaks, we try to understand the psyche, the attitude of that person who is known as a character in the story. Also remember that some characters change in the due course of the events while some remain the same. And this is what is known as static and round character. Static character is one which does not change throughout the story, remains the same, whereas a round character is that who shows some kind of change in its attitude and behavior by the end of the story. The character can not be just a person, but it can also be a place, nature, or social entity. As I had already mentioned earlier, that any central character has to fight with either with the nature, that is opposite force of the central character, or a place maybe. Let us say for example any place that is hostile, that is non-livable for that person, he fights out with the situations there, or a social entity. So it all can be considered as a character, not only that hero or a villain or a heroine or the or the comedian is the character. The another very important element of the short story is setting. Setting is defined as it's a background against which the action of the story takes place. It includes society, culture, historical time, and general background like a home, room, or a particular place. Remember, any action that takes place and the confrontation of the character only matters when we know the background of them. Even if we do not know the background of two fighting people, we cannot understand what that fight is for, and we cannot understand the whole scene. So in order to understand the narration, the action, the motives of the people, we also need to look into a little bit of background, which might be a historical or social or the past life of the people. Many times the background is historical or cultural also, we need to understand that. Also that sometimes it also describes some kind of background like a stage setting, a home, a room, or a particular place. Thank you.